Welcome back, fantasy readers, sophisticated fantasy readers. Before we get started with today's lesson, let's review our anchor chart about sophisticated readers of fantasy. When we started learning about fantasy, we were researching the setting. And then as we moved on, we talked about who has the power, and we talked about finding evidence of that power. Then we decided we could learn alongside the main character, since we come to the story not really knowing all that much. And sometimes we even learn things before the characters learn them. How to keep track of multiple problems, and suspending judgment about characters and places until we know all the information, because we can always change our mind about the characters we're learning about. So now we need to catch up on this anchor chart from the lessons that we did last week. So let's move here, and let me set it up right there. And what we're going to do now is talk about how last week's lessons taught us that we can read fantasy readings metaphorically. And we did that first when we talked about those dragons that characters face. Not the literal dragons in fantasy stories, but the dragons that you can face in any genre of a story. Any obstacle can be a dragon. And I'm sure you all remember that lesson. Then we talked about internal and external quests, where the external quest is when the characters, for instance, in fantasy, have kind of a job to do, where they are going to rescue someone or they are going to destroy an item. Whereas the internal quest can be something within. How are you going to fix something within yourself as a character? And that can also be in any genre. Then we talked about how we can apply lessons that we're learning in these fantasy stories to our own life. So here's the literal dragon, but there are also dragons in our real life that we deal with every day. Today, I'm going to go ahead and we'll complete this anchor chart. And today's lesson is going to be about comparing themes in fantasy and history. Comparing themes in fantasy and in history. So I want to talk about the subject of themes in books. We've been noticing that there are several themes that are reappearing consistently in many fantasy books, in the different fantasy books. But if you think about it a little bit longer, some of those same themes can be found in other genres as well, not just the fantasy genre that we're in right now. So they can be found in narratives, informational, opinion, and biographies. So today I want to teach you that good readers assume that some themes are universal and can be found across a number of genres and history as well. Good readers use their knowledge of history to help them find out how a story might go. Many historical figures have faced dragons, not the literal dragons, the metaphorical dragons. Would you agree that the major historical figures had to fight dragons of their own in order to imagine or impact history? So let's look at 3 historical figures that you are familiar with. The first is going to be George Washington, Rosa Parks, and finally Harriet Tubman. I'll show you what I'm looking at. And let's think about the dragons that they fought and how that impacted history. Autofocus. So let's start with George Washington. Here are some bullet points of his accomplishments. What he did, he unified the American army and he beat the British. That's a huge accomplishment in our history. his quest, his adventure, to win out against the British a bigger army. Did he do that? Yes, that's his accomplishment. This was his quest. What were the dragons, the metaphorical dragons that he overcame? They overcame cold and hunger in Valley Forge and getting men to believe in the fight. So this is a metaphorical dragon that George Washington and his army had to face. I think maybe you're getting the idea of the lesson now. Let's move on to Rosa Parks. You probably already know what her dragon was. Let's look at her accomplishments. Getting civil rights passed. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 becomes a law. What was her quest? Equality. On the buses and the schools where there was segregation and people were separated based on the color of their skin. And her quest was to create desegregation so that everyone could be together. What were the dragons? Segregation, the separation of people based on their color. Racism, when people mistreated each other because of their color. And ignorance, when people just didn't know any better. Let's finally look at Harriet Tubman. What were her accomplishments? She freed slaves through the Underground Railroad. Her quest was to get to the North and escape the South from slavery. And what were her metaphorical dragons? Hatred, branding, lynching, and slavery. Those are some pretty serious metaphorical metaphorical dragons. These are real things, but we're calling them dragons because they are the obstacles that these three heroes had to face. So your task today is to think of a historical figure and make a chart the way we made one that I just showed you about George Washington, Rosa Parks, and Harriet Tubman. Choose a historical figure. I have a couple of choices for you here. I thought maybe Ruby Bridges might be a good choice. Paul Revere could be a good choice. Oops. And Martin Luther King Jr. would be a good choice. You don't have to use these. If you think of another historical figure that you would like to use, that would be awesome. These are just some examples for you. So choose a historical figure. Give me a couple of bullet points of their accomplishments. What was their quest? And what were those metaphorical dragons, those obstacles that these historical figures had to face? Now you can do one historical figure or you can do several historical figures. It's really going to be up to you. So your job for this task is to pick a historical figure, list any accomplishments, list the quests, and the dragons that those historical figures had to face, and send it on to your teacher, however you've been sending your work to your teacher. I hope you enjoyed the lesson today. That was fun. I'll see you next time. Bye.